Okay, and I'll hand over to Adrian, who has been kind enough to join us from the UK. It's sort of unfortunately ungodly hours, so I hope it's not too bad getting up at 3 o'clock or something in the morning. And Adrian's going to be talking about the question of AI and financial services, build, buy, or partner. So Adrian, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, it was a bit of a shock to the system when the alarm went off at 3 o'clock this morning. I won't lie. There was a bit of, wow, what's happening here? So just for a little bit of context, everyone, my name's Adrian Smith. I am alumni of Waikato University. I studied there, did my BMS and MMS in the 90s. I am that old. And today we're going to be looking into the problem statement of how can we quickly turn data into insight when dealing with unstructured data sets such as customer verbatim. So just to take you through the problem statement a little bit, one of the challenges I have in my day-to-day role is I'll be trying to look at problems that are generated via complaints, via NPS verbatim, via telephony call desk kind of sheets discussing the nature of an issue, and trying to glean insight into that is a very difficult undertaking. For those of you dealing with AI, you know this already. And so if you're not dealing with AI and you're trying to do it the old-fashioned way by eyeballing all the data, it's a time-consuming event. And especially when you see something like your NPS just fall off a cliff, and then the great and the good say, what's going on there? And you're like, uno momento. If you could just give us about 4 hours to eyeball a few hundred line items, we'll try and figure that out. And so one of the challenges we've been trying to grapple with is, well, how do we sift through all the millions of lines of data we've got to try and get that insight so we can then find something actionable that we can go and fix? And so that's kind of where we started. It was like, okay, we need to figure out how to turn all this data into insight, because at the moment, data in and of itself isn't particularly useful, especially if you're trying to fix things. And, you know, as you can imagine, being a fellow Kiwi, for most of the Kiwis in the audience, I'm quite interested in getting stuff done, as opposed to just admiring the problem, as the Brits would say. So we've looked at a different number of problem scenarios. So we looked at kind of building, we looked at buying, we looked at partnering. So today's discussion is going to walk through some of my experiences on the job. Although I hasten to add that my experiences today are mine and my alone, my comments, they do not reflect those of my employer, just in case anyone's interested. Okay, so when we started to look at build, it started to look to me like this was a potential trap if you're a large organization. If you're an organization of scale who has resources, oftentimes you can fall into the trap of thinking, well, you know, we can build this. We got some fairly clever technology guys. We know our business. You know, maybe we can build this. And so part of the experience that I had was we were looking to actually bring in a chat bot. And in this particular case, the chat bot was looking to deal with low-level transactional queries. And we thought, well, maybe we could do this. We could bring in some AI that would then deal with a lot of these low-level, low-value transactions that actually cost us money to process offline, people, humans on phones. Can we build a chatbot experience that will enable the machine to answer the low-level questions? And at the point it becomes a little bit too difficult for the chatbot to answer, then hand it over to a human operator, a human basically, but a human oversight as well as the good old-fashioned like person-to-person chat. And one of the very early lessons we learned was when you're teaching a machine something to do for the first time and it's actually not your core capability, it's really difficult. And it was like teaching the machine was like trying to teach a child to walk. And we had all these challenges, right, where you'd get a unstructured question and you think, right, well, what are kind of the main answers you can give? And once we realized that we couldn't really address an unstructured question in and of itself, we needed to start with some defined parameters. So we then went down the path of trying to work with decision trees, and so saying, these are the kind of questions and branches off of that tree. Well, actually, where shall we start? So obviously we started with some heartlands, and we decided through looking at sheer volume of queries, let's start with the high volume, low value transactions and start to figure out FAQ type responses for the machine from that. And so obviously we get our first test in the world. We have 6 use cases using Facebook Messenger. And one of the real challenges you have is you have to feed the machine lots of data. And in our case, we were relying on customer feedback to come back in. And so in the early days and the early adoption of the chatbot, when very few people are using it, you're not getting a huge amount of data points to actually try and help improve the machine learning process. So that was a bit of a trap, like trying to make sure you can feed in data about something that is in principle fairly new to us as an organization. So then once you've gotten through trying to feed the data into the machine, you then have the issue of organizational expectations. To be fair, and with the greatest respect to everyone do AI today, it's not as intelligent as we'd like to believe. It's certainly not Skynet from the Terminator series, that's for sure. And so you're trying to feed machine into the data, you're trying to manage stakeholder expectations of, is this the next big thing? Is this going to completely change the game for our business? And you have to sort of say, whoa, we need to crawl before we walk, before we eventually run. And finding an organization that is willing to commit to the time scale attached to that, I think that can also be a challenge, because in the nature of the business I'm in, there's always this drive for go faster, now, let's get results now, which, unsurprisingly, right? We all want to remain a going concern. We want to be able to add value as quickly as possible. But when you're dealing with something that you're essentially teaching it from a baby through to adulthood, it's quite an amount of effort required, as well as resilience, as well as a commitment from an organization in terms of time and money and resources. So that's something you need to be aware of if you're going to be going down that path, if you haven't already. And then there's also the piece around, well, how much faith can you place in the AI that you're creating? Because when you're doing that and you're feeding it lots of data, obviously during the pandemic, in many organizations and many industries, the nature of the normal has changed. And we have this phrase that's overused in the UK called the new normal. And like, if things return to something vaguely resembling the old normal, how many of these models or patterns or these algorithms actually have any value? And so that's something else you need to be really mindful of as you build stuff. And then there's the other thing that you need to be very mindful of when you're learning on the go. The challenge that we found was we started making a lot of mistakes that the established players have been doing this for a while had already overcome. And so the example I point to is years ago in the early noughties, you had all the European car manufacturers decide they wanted to build their own proprietary GPS systems, sat navs and stuff, because that's what everyone had. And so in doing so, they failed to learn the lessons of people like Garmin and TomTom and others who'd been at it for quite a number of years at that point. And so if you're renting a car in Europe in the noughties, and you'd be in like a BMW or a Mercedes, and you'd be driving along, and you get the dreaded, please turn around, take a left turn. There'd be nothing to turn into until a lake. And so one of the other traps, if you try and build it yourself, is you're then prone to repeating the errors and the mistakes of those who've already blazed the trail. And so obviously the smart thing to do is try and find out what those mistakes are prior to running to them to yourself. But when you're blazing and breaking new ground, sometimes it doesn't occur to you. So that's just something else to be aware of, which is why I refer to potentially a trap for large scale organizations. Another thing you need to be very aware of too is, in order to make it work today, you need an ongoing organizational commitment to a multi-year program. And sometimes in large organizations, you have funding cycles that are only 12 months in duration. And so the ability to show in-year results when you're starting from a standing start, very difficult to achieve. And so again, you need to make sure that if you're dealing with this relatively immature technology, and you've got the organization thinking it's the next big thing, you need to manage expectations appropriately, because if they're mismanaged, the expectations will be far greater than what can be achieved in 12 months. Now, a decade from now, probably it's going to be super easy. It's going to be done in such a way that it's easily embedded into ecosystems from scratch. And there'll be a whole lot of providers out there who've got so much knowledge out the box, it's going to be brilliant. But today, it's a bit of a challenge. But I think if you manage to get the build right, and you leverage all of the assets of your own organization through its insight and how it knows its own customers, knows its own product sets, then I really believe that the benefits are substantive. And I'm sure others have spoken to that today, so I won't speak to that too much. But the things you can do in terms of improving your operational efficiency, managing risk and impairment, reducing conduct risk and fraud, which is a big deal for us in banking in the UK, conduct risk, as well as just being better connected to customer needs and or concerns is just, it's a good thing. So I think my big takeaway from the build work that I was involved in was the moment you stray outside of your lane and try and do something that's similar but not the same, it's very, very challenging. So I would argue that if you are going to do this, you know, as my first year professor at Waikato used to say, he'd say, stick to your knitting. And so if your core business is just banking and transactions and statements and payments, stick to that. Because when you stray beyond that, it's a lot harder, and the learning curve is steeper in my experience. So having flirted with build and done a bit of build work, and there's some other stuff we've done with sort of algorithms, then started to address, at least look into the question of buy. And so one of the key considerations when you look at buy is, well, actually, how good is the AI out of the box? And so that's one of the first things you try to figure out and establish. And so there are different ways and means to assess that. But essentially what you're trying to figure out is, if we buy this off the shelf, how much configuration are we going to need to do to this thing? How much can we just get just straight out the gate? And so interestingly, as you know, if you've ever dealt with suppliers, you'll talk to them and they'll sort of say, yes, we can do it all. We can give you what you want. It'll just take a little bit of time. And that's part of the challenge, is being able to pass the data they speak to you about and the promises made and actually reflect on, well, can they do this or not? And so when you're looking at sort of buying technology off the shelf, there's a number of factors to consider. And so from my personal experience, there are a number of challenges. One of the ones that we looked into was basically, where is data processed? So in the UK, we have a lot of regulation around data. We've got GDPR, talks around data privacy. We also have the issue of, in my particular case, we had to deal with ISO 27001 around data privacy. And so anyone we're going to be sharing any data with or doing anything database, we need to be able to understand where that data is being processed, both across the world, as well as, you know, is it going to be processed in cloud services, or is there an on-prem solution? Now, obviously, on-prem is fairly quaint these days, but and then if we're going to use cloud services, where are those cloud services based? Now, obviously, it's pretty easy to create a partition in cloud services to section off the data so it can't be obviously exploited from other places, but then you have to go through all of the related data concerns and basically making sure your internal teams, the internal security teams, have kicked the tires on sort of the quality of all those different capabilities. So, you know, from personal experience, it took us many, many years to get comfortable with Amazon, and for reasons that I'm not quite certain about, because when we initially looked at AWS services, it was still so new, the idea of actually, could we have our data anywhere other than on premise in our own bits of kit and our own tech stacks? So that's one of the things that you had to think about a lot, and be very mindful of that. Then there's the issue around, well, because of the GDPR rules in the UK, the data privacy rules, thinking around things like personal identifiable information and how is that processed and how do we handle that? The moment data leaves your network, it leaves your universe, how do we make sure that it's not available, it's protected, because it's a massive, obviously, point. And so having to work through the issues, or how do we redact the data? Are there data redaction services? How can that be done? Because obviously we would hate to have a situation where our customer data falls into the hands of the wrong people, right? And obviously we have a duty of care, amongst other things, towards making sure we protect customer data and privacy. And so that's another one of the challenges of, if you're going to sort of buy stuff in, is that how will that work? And then there's the issue of third-party failure. So one of the things that you also need to be mindful of is, and we saw this in other parts of the industry, where there was a high concentration around a few suppliers, and when one supplier fell over, a number of the fintechs had some issues with their payments capabilities a couple of years ago, because it was one of their core component systems handled by a single supplier. And so then if you're going to have third-party failure, you need to make sure that you've got appropriate redundancies. Then there's also the issue of failover when you're dealing with the system dependencies on AI, because sometimes if you've got AI and you've brought it in and you've plugged it into a number of component systems, sometimes you may not have awareness of all the things that plug in and drive the AI. And so sometimes I've heard about it, never seen it myself. You could run into a dreaded black swan event where there's a failure and no one knows how or why, because the value chain driving all of that is unknown. There's all these things you need to consider. And then there's also the piece around the connection to big data itself. How are we going to make sure that whatever we buy in has access to our big data? And does the big data, is it an essential warehouse? Is it like something like a Teradata solution, or is it dispersed among numerous databases? How are you going to connect all that up? Do you create a data layer where you bring all the data of the organization together so it can then feed into the machine of whatever you've built from a third party, or whatever you bought from a third party? I think part of the really big challenge, though, is after you've gone through all of that and you've done all your due diligence trying to figure out, is this the right solution for the team, for our needs? You then still have to go through the governance process of getting them onto the preferred supplier list, where people have to go do site visits and all these other things. It's quite the undertaking. However, if you do get the right solution, then actually buying could be a very, very reasonable response, especially if you don't have the resources to go out and build it yourself. Now, I had the really good fortune of doing some work with an Auckland-based technology company, Touchpoint Group. And they had a brilliant AI out of the box. I'm not going to turn this into a sales pitch for what they achieved, but part of what made the AI out of the box so effective, at least from my experience working with them, was they built a pre-canned ontology for financial services. So for those who are unfamiliar with ontology, it's a way to thematically group feedback. And so what their AI did straight out the box was you'd upload your data set via an FTTP server, and it would then go away, and the algorithms would then sift through all the unstructured content, all the unstructured verbatim, and then what they then do is they then group into very key thematics around the ontology. And so if I was to estimate how accurate the ontology was for the purposes of what I was trying to do, it was probably upwards of 85 to nearly 90% accurate. Now, obviously there was some nuances because it was built out in New Zealand. The original AI designer is actually a former Waikato student as well. Never met him, but I quite liked his work when I got to use it. And what it allowed me to see very quickly exactly what were the key themes in the customer verbatim, saying this is why this is what's happened in my experience, and this is why the NPS scores have fallen off a cliff. And so I think chief amongst that is I've spent 20 years doing digital work, and so I am very used to democratized data. I'm very used to being able to go and find the information I need from web analytics, from insight packages, to be able to go off and then try and take action to fix and amend and fix pain points. This kind of tool, if it's done right, it allows you to be able to do those things at speed, because one of the internal challenges, at least I faced, was I'd put in a briefing for, hey, NPS has fallen off a cliff. Why? And I'd then rely on internal teams to then go away and we'd have a briefing meeting. They'd go away and analysts would look at things and they'd come back with an answer that was only 80% level confidence, which I guess is fine if you're looking for broad thematic areas of this is where the problem is. But if you want to actually get on and do something, that actual insight, it was hard to figure out exactly what to do. It's one thing to say, there's a problem with payments. Okay, brilliant. Which payment system? We have multiple payment systems that we use. Which one is it? And when you can't get to that level of granularity, it's kind of frustrating. And so that was, again, one of the key drivers of the problem statement of how do we turn our mountains of data into insight. And so if you have something like that and you have an ontology that allows you to quickly pass information to thematics, and in the case with the Touchpoint capability, Epiphany, spelled with an I, we had the ability to upload data and then get meaningful results in hours. Now, obviously, there was a piece around the ontology because it was built via the Australian and New Zealand context. There were elements of the UK context that were, could not be considered. So how do you deal with idiom as part of one of the practical challenges? There are certain things or phrases that are said in the UK that are, well, we wouldn't say in New Zealand and we wouldn't say in Australia. So you have to allow for idiom and different kind of language variants that may not always be easily understood, and you'd have to teach the machine that. But if you can get something straight out the box where there's already logic in place that then deals with kind of those elements around an industry, in our case, financial services, can be a massive boon for really cutting through the data to get to insight into doing meaningful things. So let's be specific. When I posed the question to the Touchpoint group, I sort of said, look, NPS has taken a bit of a hit. Can you go have a look at it and see what the machine can do, please? And they did. And the very next day, and they turned around and said, hey, we don't know anything about your data. We just took your raw data file, uploaded it, and then one of our data officers then kind of looked at it and looked at it with the analysts. And then we've come back with these kind of 5 key thematic areas. And then they started to articulate not only the impact it had on NPS in terms of where are the 5 key areas to focus, but it also sized the level of problem. Like this particular issue appears to be dragging your NPS by 4.6 points. This one's dragging your NPS by 3 points. And all of a sudden, straight out the box, we had a stacked ranked list of things to prioritize and fix in order to try and recapture lost ground on the NPS, which for me was really powerful. And so when you can come across capabilities like that, they can actually be game changers if you really, really focus on that customer centricity and really dealing with the feedback loop from customers. And so that's one of the advantages of buyers, because they've had the learnings, it's their daily bread, it's all they do. And, you know, they've spent 7, 8, 9, 10 years doing that thing that they do. And so you get all the best thinking straight out the box. Whereas in the buyer scenario, you still have prone to repeating the errors and the mistakes that they may have made years ago. And so from my perspective, if you are going down the path of using AI within financial services to do stuff, I would definitely strongly advise that if you can find someone who's been doing this for a long time and actually understands the industry you're in, that would give you a massive leg up in terms of trying to build this and embed it into your systems and processes. The last question I'm going to consider today is, well, okay, that sounds pretty cool, but what about partnering? Is there a partnering situation that makes sense? And so it's one thing to buy it in and have a preferred supplier relationship. It's another, and you have them around and harass them for different things. But what about partnering? What kind of does that give you? And so from what I've been trying to do, I really like the idea of partnering, and I'll tell you why. When you deal with your internal teams who really know your customers, they know what's going on, they know who they are, they know what they do, and then when you find AI capability that helps you understand what is the pebble in their shoe, what is the thing that's irritating them that you could potentially help with, that's a powerful thing. But when you have a buy situation and someone can really help you establish that pebble in the shoe with quite a degree of accuracy and builds actual insight that you can go and work on, that's really powerful. So bringing those together for me makes a heck of a lot of sense. Bringing all the internal knowledge that you have of everything you do, plus all of the ability to find very quickly what is the pebble in people's shoe. I think that's a brilliant situation, and if you have the ability to do so, I would strongly encourage it. Obviously, finding the right partner is tricky, and if anyone's ever done partnering agreements, they can be challenging, to say the least. But for me, there is so much value in finding a partner who has actual experience integrating with an organization. In my experience, oftentimes you'll meet a partner they'll make a lot of promises, but they don't actually understand the practicalities of integrating with a large, complex business. And so oftentimes there'll be a number of own goals that they hit because they just don't understand. And so if you are going to go down the partnering path, I would strongly urge you to find those who've actually done it before, because there'll be a lot who'll tell you a brilliant story and they'll tell you what you want to hear, but the reality can sometimes be a long way off the pace. I mean, one of the other things I've found in my experience is if you can partner with maybe an SME whose livelihood is quite strongly leveraged and maybe depends a little bit on the arrangement succeeding, I think that sets you up for a lot of success, because in my experience, when you're dealing with other large organizations, right, and no one's going to point at you and say, hey, you got that wrong, bringing in the most expensive name in town, because everyone knows them, everyone's heard of them. But when they're a large organization, they don't typically, in my experience, give you the level of support that sometimes you need. especially when you're working through tricky, nuanced issues in the weeds. Whereas if you've got a smaller organization whose whole reason for being is based on making this work, you generally tend to find you get extraordinary effort. And when you get that extraordinary effort and you manage to focus on the right things and you've got the right internal stakeholders driving the right conversations about what we're going to do next, then I think you can get a much better outcome. And so when I sort of reflect on kind of my experience via build, I reflect on my experience around buy and partnering. If you can, I would definitely think about kind of, well, what are the pros and cons of each for you as an organization? But if there is an opportunity to find someone who's potentially doing AI today, who's doing it at a really high level, who can help you really quickly, I would strongly advise that, because things like having that capability out the box that gets you up and running quickly. Like I was personally shocked that within an evenings with the work in New Zealand, because I was asleep in the UK at the time, the next day I had this most detailed breakdown of the 5 thematics. So there were 17 issues identified. Now, for context, my own team, they reviewed the data themselves, that eyeballed them, a few of them eyeballed it, only got through, a quarter of the data set, and only hadn't found half the things that the machine had sort of drawn issue to. And actually, the machine also highlighted a number of things that we weren't aware of around potential fraud issues and some risks. And so that for me is invaluable, because it's such an efficient use of time and data to actually get to the heart of the issue. And so obviously, if you are going to go down that path, or you already going down that path, these are things I would usually consider, because for me, there are a number of pitfalls that you just need to be aware of. And I can't speak highly enough of when you are working with someone who's really good at this sort of thing. Now, obviously, there are a bunch of other issues related to AI, and others have spoken to it, around ethics, around transparency, what happens in the box, etc. And obviously, one of the conversations that we had was, well, okay, what exactly is going on in the black box, and can we lift up the lid? Which obviously that then goes down the path of IP and sort of, well, what is proprietary to the organization? And if you're going to buy or partner, can you actually do that? And so that's always obviously a tricky conversation, because inevitably, one of the things you'll want to do is to say, well, what have you got? And then what have we got? And then do a side-by-side comparison. And so another one of the really interesting sort of challenges that I've faced into is, well, how do we do a like-for-like comparison? And I guess if I was to reflect back my experience, when trying to find a like-for-like test, that's quite difficult to do, because the algorithms that we'd built, the AI that we'd built, was all around very specific use cases, trying to solve for very specific things like complaints about payments, to do with NPS issues around balances and transactions and statements. And so when you then try and set up a like-for-like test, unless the abilities are compatible, it's very hard to do that. Then you got the challenges over, well, which data sets can we use, and how do we remove all the PII, and how to redact all the information? And when you're trying to work through all of that, sometimes the process of trying to figure out how an apples to apples comparison can work can often be longer than just sort of saying, well, let's just have a go. And so admittedly, because I'm of the digital mindset, do we even say that anymore? I don't know, but we still do a little bit over here. When you just want to fail fast and figure out, does this work or not? Sometimes you want to get away from just having meetings about, shall we do this or not, to just, let's just try it and see what we get. And when you look at all that, and when I sort of reflect on kind of what we got out of the box versus what we tried to build ourselves, one of the other big challenges I found in terms of end user consumption was the internal stuff. It was very much for data scientists. And unless you're a data scientist, or add a data scientist to interpret it for you, there was a few challenges with passing that information in a meaningful way. Well, what do I do with that? Whereas if you're working with a company that you can potentially partner with or buy in, one of the things I would hope they have is they have a really lovely user interface that then allows it to be consumable. And so anyone from the top of the organization to the entry-level folks doing the work on the ground, anyone has the ability to go in and basically interrogate the data, see something meaningful, and then take away their own meaning, and then as well as an action plan of what to do about that. And that's one of the challenges when you build it yourself is, whilst you may have all the brilliant data science and that sits behind it, if the data is not consumable and you can't really see the insight without help, that's one of the things that also leads to a lag in efficiency in being able to turn that data into insight and then take meaningful action. So that's something else to also be aware of is, can that data into insight be consumed? Can the access be managed at various levels across the business? So there's a piece around access, control, and permissions, because obviously different levels of audience will require different levels of content. So in summary, I would say that building it was challenging, although I think in my experience of building it, we kind of strayed outside of our lane a little bit, and that sort of then made the building process more difficult. In terms of buying, there are a lot of things to consider when considering a vendor or supplier. And partnering, though, I think potentially is the best of those, both those worlds, where you can bring the insight from within the organization about how everything works, as well as all the good thinking straight out the box from the companies, and then make sure you've got a relationship in place that allows you to then influence the roadmap of activity and things that are being built. One of the things I was very keen on was, if we bring in an SME and their future business model is tied to the success of what we're doing, we can then be very prescriptive in what we'd like them to build in order to enhance the capability. And obviously, if it's financial services related and we're trying to do financial services based things, obviously the things they can do is then portable more broadly to the financial services industry. So as long as we can let go of the IP or whatever clever idea we have, that's another way. Or you can box off and say, well, this is just for us. But that's been my experience trying to do that in the UK. It's been very interesting. And so, Michael, I'm going to hand it back to you. That's the end of what I was going to talk about today.
Okay, thank you very much, Adrian. I can see, let's give Adrian a round of applause. I can't hear the auditorium, but I can see clapping there. So I've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, can you comment on the regulatory impact on AI innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are massive amounts of regulatory impacts in the UK. You've got, gosh, where do I start there? Regulatory impact. So the AI I've been dealing with has been kind of mostly either customer facing, but nothing to do with personally identifiable information. And then obviously there was the internal piece around, well, actually how do we deal with that? But from a regulatory standpoint, obviously there's so many broad applications, and speakers earlier today, judging from the program, have spoken to that. And so there's a key piece around, well, from an ethics perspective, are you able to, is the AI doing things in an ethical way that treats customers fairly? Because in the UK, there's a really big emphasis on making sure customers are treated fairly. And so whenever you're putting AI into a process that makes decision-making, if I'm a customer and I've been, let's for argument's sake, I've been turned down for a unsecured loan, and then I say, well, actually, I'd like to appeal that decision. And then if we turn around and say, well, the machine says so, machine says no, as the Brits like to say, there's a number of issues with that, right? And so from a regulatory standpoint, this is why if the regulator would like to understand how decisions have been reached, if we cannot articulate that answer because it's too much of a black box, if we don't have that human oversight of the decision-making process the machine's making, then we put ourselves on really, really sticky ground. And so the regulator is very keen to make sure, under the ban of treating customers fairly, that AI isn't coming in and introducing bias. And so that's part of the problem, right? When you're building AI, at least from what I've observed, when you're feeding the machine data, sometimes there's bias in the data. And then so you then programatize bias into your algorithms. And so that's the kind of thing that's really, really tricky ground. It's very difficult to navigate. And so that's why it's important that you're able to speak to, well, these are the reasons why that decision was rendered. This is where you came up short. And then we have the ability to have an informed and human conversation to people, right? Because whilst technology is a great enabler, in my opinion, it can't ever replace the human-to-human relationship, because that's where business occurs, right? It happens person to person by trust. And sometimes, and no matter how clever the AI, at least what we have today, it doesn't quite achieve that. And so I don't know if we'll ever reach that point, but it's one thing to be aware of. And so when you do get it wrong, the regulator can be very heavy-handed, and then there's a lot of time spent in front of the FCA, one of the local outfits over here in the PRA, defending kind of actions taken and doing a bit of a deep dive into exactly what transpired in this particular case.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on digital finance opportunities for New Zealand?
I'd be a little bit disingenuous there because I'm not as familiar with the local New Zealand context. Apologies for that, although I'm hoping to remedy that shortly. But my suspicion is, right, if you can do the kind of decision that would potentially take a human just who's going to go through and check boxes to determine level of lending, like overdrafts, like loans, potentially even mortgages, I think there's a lot of opportunities there. I think there's also opportunities in terms of leveraging AI, and as we know, the investment industry does that. I'm not going to speak to that hugely because that's not my industry. But what I would say, though, is because so much money is made within the investment realm where decisions made in milliseconds, that if you've got an AI that is able to read the market and the patterns, which the big business have been doing for a long time, that can lead to a source of advantage where you can take advantages of fluctuations and variance across the market. And in a time of great volatility like we've had during the pandemic globally, it could be a massive advantage if your AI is milliseconds quicker than everyone else's and allows you to execute trades and business in a way that's beneficial to both your business and its stakeholders and sort of shareholders.
Okay. So I mean, one of the things that I would guess is a challenge, and you talked about sort of partnering or buying, is sort of finding an appropriate organisation that they have the sort of right background. So the question that someone posed, and I think it's a really good one, do you have any thoughts on the relevance of fundamental and AI research at tertiary institutions in supporting innovation in the financial services industry?
Oh, I think it's vital because research organizations, tertiary institutions, it's the lifeblood of trying to move this field forward. Because a lot of folks, I come from a very large I work for a very large organization which has, quite a bit of resources that it can pour into this. But it'll just be one of many things the organization is looking at any given time, and kind of the backing for that and the organizational commitment to that can sometimes disappear depending on funding cycle and how well things are going or not. Whereas when you've got a tertiary institution that's got a whole academia and you've got students and everyone all working towards trying to explore and expand the field, I think it's a massive asset and advantage. When I was in Waikato in the 90s, 1995, I remember, was when we got computers into the computer lab. And I remember just being oh wow, mind blowing. The internet, the world is available at our fingertips. And I just remember thinking to myself, this is going to change the world. And so it caused me to stay on and do my master's to explore the topic in more detail. And because I had the environment to go explore that, even though it was a very new and untested idea at the time, it really then set up the rest of my career and the way I started thinking about the world. Because I remember in my thesis kind of conclusion, I wrote, when I grew up, knowledge is power, but in the ubiquitous age of the internet, with the sum of all human knowledge at our fingertips, knowledge is no longer power. It's the ability to intelligently interrogate all that knowledge. That'll be the difference in the future. And I spoke to the rise of potential search engines. I didn't call them back then. I called them intelligent interrogation machines. And I also spoke to the ability to aggregate all that information in a meaningful way so customers could make informed decisions. So when you look at kind of AI through that lens and through what academic tertiary institutions are doing, constantly pushing the boundary and exploring very interesting ideas, it's only when you explore lots of interesting ideas that eventually you'll find that nugget, that thing that changes the game, which really materially improves people's lives. One of the rules we have is if you're going to do digital innovation, if you're going to try and change and establish pattern of behavior, it needs to be at least 10 times better than what people do today. Otherwise, you'll experience apathy or inertia. And so unless people are out there exploring and trying to understand and sort of kick over the rocks and look at all these different interesting ideas and do something with them, the field wouldn't move as quickly. And so I think tertiary education's research institutions have a massive part to play in sort of driving forward the thought leadership of the world, in my opinion.
And if I can throw in one very short comment of my own, developing underlying techniques is also a key area. So techniques to allow intelligent systems to be to explain what they're doing is something that is being worked on quite actively in research spheres.
I think it's vital, right? Because like I alluded to earlier, if you can't explain what the machine is doing, if it's just a black box where stuff goes in, stuff comes out, if you don't understand the why of things, then how can you ever possibly defend it or stand behind it? And so when you're working on these types of activities, understanding the underlying principles, trying to understand the key drivers, because oftentimes innovation is happenstance or just good luck. But if you don't understand what drove you to that, then how can you replicate it in the future? And so one of the things we look at around innovation, one of the things I've done in my career is looked at jobs to be done. And it's this whole idea of finding the customer struggle and then trying to systematize a way of then turning that struggle into a saleable and shippable product, as we refer to, or a feature or capability that's actually useful to customers. And so if you don't understand sort of the nature of innovation and how you can turn problems into really good ideas that become value adding for customers in your business, then you might catch lightning in a bottle once, maybe twice, but you can't do it with any kind of consistency and continuity.
Okay. There were two more specific questions. So one of them is, what are some customer insight platforms you have seen or would recommend, NLP across customer feedback channels?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, the brilliant platform that I use that's actually based out of Auckland is the Epiphany platform, IPIPHANY. And the CEO is a former Waikato man, and his lead developer for the AI is also a former Waikato man. And of the ones that I've assessed, it was brilliant because beyond the ontology and the use of industry classifications and the boxing up of thematics, the user interfaces was incredible because not only did it group using the NLP to determine, it goes so far beyond keywords, it's not even funny. What it does is it looks at and one of the really interesting concepts that it had that really caught my attention back in 2018, it had this idea of network diagrams where you'd have the size of a thematic in a bubble, and then you'd have all the related issues to that. And I remember when I was looking at the original demonstration with the CEO, Frank, he was showing me this airports example. And so one of the key big bubbles in the data set was wait time. And then in the network diagram, it's kind of like a spiderweb diagram. And then showed, well, actually, these are all the key factors that also contribute to wait time that also have their own commentary. And it's around long queues, inability to check it online, and a whole host of other factors. And so seeing the network effects beyond just a single, hey, waiting time is bad, figure that out. Seeing the web of related things, that was brilliant. There's a few others that we examined in the UK because we did our due diligence. We looked at internal options, but that tool of the ones I've examined, of which there's a half a dozen, was easily best. And I would recommend that if you get a chance, reach out to Touchpoint, reach out to the CEO, Frank Van Velden. They're doing some really brilliant things there and they never cease. So one of the things that they did as we were working through a proof of concept was he realized in fairly short order in the UK there's a mountain of publicly available data. And so we just started discussing, like, well, mate, do you want to potentially analyze that versus your own internal data? I mean, yeah, that'd be nice. And so off the back of being able to compare publicly available data to our internal data, we're able to build a really nice picture of the entire peer group as a benchmark exercise. And normally when you do benchmarking exercise, you normally bring in a research company that costs you a fortune. Whereas with the machine that's publicly available, you just scrape the data, upload it, because it's from the App Store reviews, and it then built a really rich picture of what was going on and where everyone's apps were. So obviously you hear a lot of narratives about your competition and how well they're doing or not, but to see the raw data from actual users and then compare it side by side, it was really, really interesting. And it also helped that not only with the ontology and the thematics that come out of the box, you have the ability to categorize that information in different ways or look for very specific or bespoke things, because obviously an ontology is just a way of grouping information in a meaningful way, but it doesn't solve for everything that's unique to your organization. And so it was the best NLP tool I've looked at.
Fantastic. Okay. And that also answered the second question, which was what was the name of that specific company in Auckland. So
Oh, yeah, Touchpoint Group Limited. So CEO Frank Vandervelden, really good guy, really, really innovative. He would love to hear from anyone who wants to sort of talk around kind of what the Epiphany tool can do straight out of the box. Because I honestly, compared to my experience in the UK, when I saw this out of the box, my mind was blown. I was like, wow, these guys from little old New Zealand are a million miles ahead of the pack here. Yes, let's talk about a proof of concept.